Hello, this video is a condensed version of a webinar organized by the Department of English, S.D College, Alleppey. This session on outcome-based education and its implications for the teaching of English is basically meant for teachers of English language and literature in colleges in Kerala. This is only a very basic introduction which attempts to demonstrate how the principles of outcome-based education could modify the teaching learning practices in the English language and literature classroom in higher educational institutions. All of us have some inkling of the term outcome-based education because we know that the student who leaves the college after 3 years of undergraduate education is not the same student who joined the college in the first year, for better or worse, more often than not for the better. Parents and society too expect to see a significant transformation in the student who passes out of college. Both their and our hopeful expectation is that the student who might be brash, rude, indifferent, or ignorant is transformed into somebody who is mature, motivated, civilized, and learned. We are also aware of the idealistic but valid expectations regarding the transformative and empowering role of education. We do believe, as the highlighted text shows, that education should help the individual to be, quote, mature and free, to flower greatly in love and goodness, unquote, and as described in the next highlighted section, quote, bring about an integrated individual who is capable of dealing with life as a whole, unquote. But we might not have thought about whether and how we as teachers are responsible for bringing about this transformation. And we do not know if anything we are doing is resulting in such a transformation. And even if we do try to consciously and deliberately bring about these changes, we do not know if such a transformation has been achieved because it seems rather unmeasurable. This is where outcome-based education could perhaps provide greater clarity into our role as teachers. To go a bit further, what would be the objective and outcomes of this session? The basic objective of this session is to make us aware about how outcome-based education can make the teaching learning process more focused and student-centric. And the outcomes for this session would be that participants would demonstrate an understanding of the main objectives of outcome-based education, and they would be able to differentiate between an objective and an outcome, and demonstrate an awareness of the different outcome levels and how they can direct teaching and learning, as well as an awareness of Bloom's taxonomy and its role in framing learning outcomes. From reading the objective and outcomes, it is hoped that the basic difference between the two terms has been understood. We will go into greater detail into these terms later. As we know, whenever we use any term, it is always important to have clarity about what they mean. In education, a certain amount of synonymity is assumed among the terms goal, objective, and outcome. For our purpose, we need to be clear about what these terms mean. Before we get into the discussion, a small ice-breaking set of questions has been created. This is just to check certain assumptions we might have about teaching in college. The first question: if we were to ask final year UG students of any batch or even PG students what kind of job they would like to take up after a degree, what do you think their answer would be? From the choices given, there is a good chance that our answer will be a job in the government sector. Now the second question: why would students prefer a government job? Students would generally agree with the first two reasons, and at least a few of them would slyly concede that the third reason too just might have crossed their mind. The next two questions get a bit tricky. The first one: if we were to ask our MA students or even our BA students who are planning to take up teaching as a career where they would like to teach, what do you think their answer would be? The likely answer would be in college. This is the tricky part. Why do you think aspiring teachers prefer to teach in a college than in a school? There is a likelihood that all the three reasons could be the answer. Though it has been tougher for us as college teachers during the pandemic, having had to do a lot of preparation for online classes and trying to assess whether learning is really happening in the online mode. And the next question, at which level did we study the most? The possibility here is that for a majority of us, it would have been at the higher secondary level, with the intensity of study at the PG level also quite significant. And finally, two questions related to the earlier questions. How did we learn that teaching in college was easier than teaching in school? From our teachers? And how did our students come to know that teaching in college was easier than teaching in school? The question is perhaps best left unanswered. The purpose of this icebreaker was also to bring to the fore two generally held perceptions. The first is that teaching in college is easier than teaching in school. We might not agree with this, particularly after online teaching started, but we could concur that it is not surprising that there is such a general perception. The second general presumption is that the teaching learning process gets less challenging as we move up educational levels. Now, if there is any validity to these presumptions, these could be seen as potential red flags because that is not the way things should be, is it? We will re-examine these presumptions towards the end of this session. Let's get back more to the point. Quality education is something that is touted by all educational institutions. But who or what is the single most important factor responsible for the quality of an institution? Is it students, the infrastructure available, the drive of the management or the PTA? It is none of these. It is simply the quality of the teacher or the quality of the teaching learning process, isn't it? This should be kept in mind by us teachers and by the management who should be valuing and nurturing their teachers. The second question is related to the earlier one. Who is a quality teacher, or when can we say teaching is effective? Is it effective when the results are extremely good, or when students give feedback that the teaching has been very good, or when teachers feel they have worked hard and done their best? Shall we get down to a more pragmatic and perhaps mundane answer? Could we say that teaching is effective simply when learning is effective? For the sake of closure, let us assume this to be true. Before we talk about how learning could become effective through outcome-based education, we need to keep in mind some extraneous factors which could critically affect learning. As teachers, we would need to constantly try and figure out how to overcome these challenges. The first question here is, which do you think is the single most important factor responsible for effective learning? That would essentially be student motivation, wouldn't it? Especially because we are dealing with adult learners. This is a significant area of study in educational psychology, and there are different ways to increase student motivation, but that is outside the scope of this session. Plato hit the nail on the head centuries ago when he observed that knowledge which is acquired under compulsion obtains no hold on the mind. The key phrase here is hold on the mind, and we will be talking about this soon. Does the personality of the teacher affect the quality of learning? Obviously it does. How sincere, caring, approachable, and hardworking we are seen to be really matters, as does our personality as a whole. More importantly, we need to be aware of what it is in us, if anything, which puts up psychological barriers around students which affect learning. The skills and abilities of teachers also affect learning. Just as there are very diverse students in class, teachers could have very diverse skills and abilities. But we definitely need certain core competencies, don't we? We would need near native competence in English language skills, a sound knowledge of pedagogical principles and English language teaching principles and practices, a sound reading habit in literary, non-literary, and critical texts would be a big plus, as would a commitment to and interest in study and research. Finally, a basic knowledge of current literary theory and terminology would be immensely helpful. But this list is not final. Again, it is up to us to understand where we stand in these skills and take necessary corrective action as and when needed because student learning can be affected by our competencies. Learner factors also affect learning. We have already identified motivation, but other factors like age or social and class factors can also negatively affect learning. We know from experience that family background is usually one common factor among troublemakers because they come from dysfunctional families or have suffered abuse. We also sometimes find very indifferent students who seem totally uninterested in and even hostile towards learning. We assume this to be their nature, but it could very well be that they simply do not have the previous knowledge to make any sense of what is happening in class. Closely allied to this could be woefully inadequate English language skills, which make them feel further lost. The indifference or hostility to learning could well be a reaction to all this. So we constantly need to be alert about these extraneous factors and try to manage them. With these extraneous factors out of the way, let's get back to effective learning. We have already come to accept the proposition that teaching is effective when learning is effective. So the next question here, would you agree with the notion that effective learning happens on the basis of what the teacher does in class? Yes would seem to be a straightforward and obvious answer. But is that the case? Let's imagine it's one of those days when we are on song as a teacher. We are waxing eloquent and words and ideas are just flowing out unendingly. But if the student has not been listening, effective learning has not happened, has it? I might be pretty pleased with myself, but learning in the student might have been non-existent. So we could very well argue that effective learning happens not on the basis of what the teacher does in class, but on the basis of what the student does in class. Therefore, learning is not the product of teaching. Learning is the product of the activity of the learners. Now, the activity the student might be doing in class could be listening or reading or pair or group work. When will learning happen? Learning happens when the students think during the process of doing. Their mind has to be focused actively on the task at hand. This is why educationists have insisted that students should be given something to do, not something to learn. And if the doing demands thinking, learning results naturally. A simple example. How do we know that students are thinking during their activity of listening to us? They will think only if we constantly ask them questions about what they are listening to. Why is thinking or intense cognitive activity essential for students to learn? That is because memory is the residue of thought. What this means is that the more you think, the more you remember. Muscle memory develops only through thinking. For example, we will know if effective learning has happened in our class if 10 years down the line a student comes and tells us, "Sir, madam, I still remember what you taught us 10 years ago. The concepts are still crystal clear in my mind and I still often apply it in my daily life." Learning has happened. Significant thinking happened in class and something new and amazing has been created in the brain of the learner out of buzzing electrical and chemical impulses. Now, there are two significant principles we have subscribed to here. The first significant movement is the realization that the teaching learning process has to be student-centric. As teachers, we should constantly be thinking about what the student is doing. Secondly, especially because we are teaching adult learners, we should embrace the movement from a behaviorist perspective on learning to a cognitivist one. Learning is not conditioned by repetitive, rote external behavior, but through thinking and by awakening the power of memory. Both these perspectives are crucial when we decide to practice outcome-based learning. So let's jump right into the nitty-gritty of things. Let's go straight to the classroom situation. What happens in an ideal classroom? Or when can we say that effective learning has happened in an individual classroom session? When can we say that any activity is successful? Only when we achieve certain predetermined goals, isn't it? So when can we say that learning has been effective or successful? We can say learning is effective when the learning outcomes decided for a teaching unit are demonstrated to have been achieved through the evaluation of thinking tasks given to students who were on task. The key words have been highlighted. What this means is that a finite list of learning outcomes were first created for the class. Thinking tasks or learning activities which would help students achieve the learning outcomes were designed or planned and given to them to do in class. The tasks were done by the students and constant feedback was given to ensure that students were on the right track. And finally, the class was assessed to check if the learning outcomes were attained. It was also ensured that students were constantly and continuously on task during the session. If any laxity was observed, students were brought back to the task because if they did not do the task, the learning outcomes would not be achieved. Now we might be aware of these ideas because they relate to terms we are familiar with, like teaching goals or learning objectives or instructional objectives. But here we are using the term learning outcome, and we need to know what this specifically means or what meaning we are giving to it specifically. Let's explore in slightly greater detail the key concept here, a learning outcome. So what is a learning outcome? A learning outcome is simply a clear statement about what the student is expected to know, be able to do, or value at the end of a study unit. It will also state how the student is expected to demonstrate that they have achieved the learning outcome. And the learning outcome must be specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. That is, it must be SMART. First, it must be specific and measurable. That is, the attainment of the learning outcome must be quantifiable. We must be able to give objective marks for the task. For example, would a statement like, by the end of the session, the student would be able to appreciate the poem, be specific or measurable? It is neither, so it cannot be an outcome. The learning outcome must be attainable. That is, it must be at the appropriate complexity level of the student's program, and the student must have the previous knowledge necessary to do the task. Understanding previous knowledge and skill is critical because learning is always incremental and builds on previous knowledge. Without necessary previous knowledge and skills, learning will be difficult. Just think about it. If any subject or concept was difficult for us, it was because we did not have the necessary previous knowledge or skills for it. Next, the learning outcome has to be relevant. It has to be a significant piece of learning and must be useful in the next educational level of the student. And it must be time-bound in the sense that the student must be able to complete the task within the time given for the task. Let's again contrast the term learning outcome with the term learning objective. We need this distinction because it will help us to formulate learning outcomes. Let's take a specific example. We can state an objective like the following statement. The aim of this session is to make students understand the concept of objective correlative. This is a learning objective. We could now rephrase the statement from a different perspective. By the end of this session, students will demonstrate the difference between showing and telling, recall Eliot's definition of objective correlative, and identify examples of objective correlative in known and unknown texts and discuss the emotions associated with it. Such a statement would be a learning outcome. So what is the difference between a learning objective and a learning outcome? A learning objective is written from the teacher's or the institution's perspective. That is, it presents the goal or intention of the teacher or the institution. It is often not specific or measurable. And it is future oriented in the sense that there is an expectation that the objective is long term. You expect the student to retain the knowledge of objective correlative for some future period of time. On the other hand, a learning outcome is written from the student's perspective. It is specific and measurable, and it presents what the student is expected to know, do, or value at the end of that specific session. The concepts of showing and telling were brought in because that was expected previous knowledge. One would expect them to know E.M. Foster's distinction here, to be able to compare it with Aristotle's mimesis and diegesis, that is imitation and narration, which is almost the same as showing and telling, and then relate these terms to Eliot's concept of objective correlative. It is very useful to understand this distinction between objective and outcome, as it could be easier for us as teachers to frame a learning objective first before we frame the learning outcome. Before we try to frame specific learning outcomes, we would need a basic understanding of some concepts closely related to outcome-based education. We had started off talking about the transformative power of education. What is it that makes the student educated in all senses of the term? Benjamin Bloom posits that there are three domains of learning in education. Students have to get knowledge, learn skills, and practice certain values. A more sophisticated version of this would be the following. What students have to develop or learn are cognitive skills or thinking and problem solving skills, affective skills or skills which help emotional and interpersonal growth, and psychomotor skills or skills related to physical activity. Let's go back a little. We had earlier defined learning outcome as a clear statement of what a student is expected to know, be able to do, or value at the end of a teaching unit. This statement is actually based on the domains of learning: knowledge, skills, and attitudes, or KSA. So the first thing to note here is that the definition of a learning outcome is actually based on Bloom's domains of learning. Holistic learning or development of the whole personality of the student is another popular catchphrase which is commonly bandied about by institutions. All one needs to do for this to happen is to focus on the teaching learning of the three domains of learning identified by Bloom. This is actually the way to ensure a holistic education. Now let's just think about our actual practice. Which domain of learning do we focus on? Our classroom teaching focuses almost exclusively on knowledge or cognitive skills, doesn't it? We assume that this is all that is expected of us. Does this mean that affective and psychomotor skills are not developed during the student's stint in college? We do see students gaining in self-confidence or developing leadership and team skills, but this is only accidental and ad hoc. It may or may not happen to a few students who are active in extracurricular activities or work diligently in a group project or do science experiments. But which skill does society or parents expect to see developed in students? If we take any teaching-oriented movie like Tare Zameen Par or Bend It Like Beckham or Good Will Hunting or Karate Kid, the focus most of the time is on developing effective skills, isn't it? On teaching values to students and helping emotional growth. This might be society's expectation, but we generally assume that teaching values or attitudes is beyond us. Now, if we plan to adopt outcome-based education, the expectation is that we ensure that teaching of affective and psychomotor skills is also included in our curriculum and syllabus. So instead of doing 100% cognitive skills, we might need to make it 70% cognitive skills and 30% effective and psychomotor skills, or some such proportion we deem appropriate. And most importantly, we would have to create learning outcomes for all three kinds of skills. So what we need to think about if we are getting into outcome-based education is: 1. What cognitive strategies and information should our students learn in this class? 2. What attitudes would be useful for students to cultivate in order for it to benefit their learning or career? And 3. What psychomotor skills would our students need in order to be successful in this class and this field of study? There's one further point. Aren't we, as teachers of English language and literature, the most suited to teach values and attitudes because the material we have, literary texts, is replete with and essentially about emotions and values? Science teachers could focus more on psychomotor skills because they do experiments, but inculcating values and attitudes could very well be our forte. So the proportion of knowledge to skills to attitudes could vary among disciplines too. Benjamin Bloom's taxonomy of cognitive skills is also crucial when we write learning outcomes. Bloom has analyzed the domain of cognitive skills in some detail and formulated a classification or taxonomy of cognitive skills into different skill levels, while other educationists have created taxonomies for the two other domains of learning identified by Bloom. What is shown in this slide is a slightly modified version of Bloom's taxonomy. The lowest level is the cognitive skill of remembering at the base of the pyramid. And you go up to the higher level cognitive skills through understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and finally creating, which is the highest level. To remember is to recall what has been taught, and it basically involves memory. The next higher level of understanding implies that the student will be able to verbalize what they know. They should be able to talk about it in their own words. Now let us think about our classroom practice for a moment. When we teach any text to any class, whether it is a general English class or a communicative English class or an English literature class, our struggle is essentially to make students understand the text. We do not seem to give much thought about or plan to teach the higher level cognitive skills, do we? So, in our teaching practice, would it be fair to say that we might not be helping students to develop their analytical and critical thinking skills? Let's take another scenario to understand the significance of this taxonomy. Would it be fair to say that students from CBSE schools generally do better in national level competitive examinations than +2 students from the government stream? Let's first assume this to be the case. Now, would you agree with the proposition that questions in national level competitive examinations like the IITG are usually what we call indirect questions or application questions? In other words, they are questions which focus on higher level cognitive skills like apply, analyze, evaluate, and create. And if students from CBSE schools do better in these exams, could it be because there is greater focus on teaching at higher level cognitive skills in the syllabus of CBSE schools? That is very likely. So what is the role of Bloom's taxonomy in teaching learning and in outcome-based education? The most important function is that they are used to frame learning outcomes. If we look closely at the right side of the pyramid, we will see a list of action verbs corresponding to each level of learning. For example, if we want to write learning outcomes intended to make students remember what they have learned, we will use action verbs like define, list, state, recall, etc. If our goal is to make them understand a concept, we would begin our learning outcome with an action verb like classify, describe, explain, or identify. And if we want to focus on a still higher level cognitive skill like apply, we would use an action verb like demonstrate, interpret, etc. in the learning outcome. If we Google learning outcomes, we'll be taken to Bloom's taxonomy and a list of these action verbs. The second related function of Bloom's taxonomy is that it helps us plan at which level of cognitive complexity we need to teach a class. So for a first semester BA English main class, our focus would be to help students remember and understand. But by the time they come to the final year, they should be getting more application questions, and at the PG level, we should be focusing almost exclusively on the higher level cognitive skills. Similarly, if we are doing an introductory session on any topic, we would be focusing on the skills of remembering and understanding rather than higher level cognitive skills. One more function of Bloom's taxonomy would be to help us set questions at different difficulty levels. We are often asked to set questions at difficulty levels like easy, average, and difficult, and we usually assume that the difficulty level of the question is based on the difficulty level of the topic. For example, a question from Derrida would obviously be difficult, while a question on Arnold would be average or easy. But what we need to keep in mind is that the same topic or concept can be learned and evaluated at different levels. Let's take an example. Let's consider a question like define and explain allophones with examples. This is a standard kind of question we ask for our internal assessment and end semester examinations. What level of cognitive skills do we test through such a question? They are expected to only remember and understand here. Could we test higher level cognitive skills on that same topic with a question like this? Would you agree with the statement that allophones are an anomaly or very unusual in a phonetic language like Malayalam? Why? Why not? Can you identify any allophones in your mother tongue? Now, which are the skill levels tested here? We could say that all the skills are being tested because they have even been asked to find new knowledge in the last part of the question. Interestingly, they can reach any higher level skill only if they go through all skills at the lower levels. In order to create, they have to remember, understand, apply, analyze, and evaluate. Now, it is extremely unlikely that we are ever going to find such a question in the question paper set by the university, but we could definitely set such questions in the internal tests. And if students can answer questions of higher cognitive complexity well, it shows that the teaching learning process has been very intense. And if at all they get a lower level question on the same topic in the university question paper, they would be able to breeze through it. There is one more concept which we have to consider when we think about learning outcomes, and that is assessment. Assessment is very closely tied to learning outcomes because a learning outcome can be assumed to have been attained only after assessment. Within this concept, it is very useful to understand two related modes of assessment. The first of these relate to the distinction between formative and summative assessment. Formative assessment is simply assessment during the process of learning. It checks if the learning outcome for a study unit has been attained, and this kind of assessment may happen on a daily or a weekly basis. It monitors and improves the learning process for every student and provides feedback to the teacher on how to improve the teaching learning process. Examples of formative assessment tests would be quizzes, objective type tests, classroom assessment techniques like the minute test, muddiest point, or think, pair, share. They are rigorous, continuous, but quite informal and may or may not be graded as part of continuous assessment. Summative assessment or evaluation happens at the end of a semester or program. It is meant to assess the student's performance in relation to the others in class and check if course learning outcomes have been met. Internal assessment is intended to be formative, while the end semester exam is summative. We now move on to the second closely related mode of assessment. A formative assessment is usually a criterion reference test, while a summative assessment is a norm-referenced test. In a criterion reference test, certain performance criteria are fixed, which students are expected to fulfill to gauge whether the learning outcomes for that unit have been attained. Let's just take a simple example. We might be teaching students the difference in the pronunciation of vowel sounds in words like bot and boat, or cot and coat, or clock and cloak, which are often confusing for students. After being given sufficient thinking tasks and oral practice to learn this difference, we could test them saying, okay, I am going to give you 10 pairs of new words with this difference in vowel sound. You will have fulfilled your learning outcome if you can pronounce a minimum of 8 pairs correctly. We have now set up a criterion which we expect all students to achieve. That is why a criterion reference test is known as a mastery test, because all students are expected to reach a certain mastery level. A norm reference test or a summative test, on the other hand, is usually a grading test, where students are graded in order to assess their performance relative to the others in class. We have come across students in the +2 government stream who score 95 to 100% in English, but who might not be able to string together one grammatical sentence in written English with correct spelling and punctuation. These marks tell us nothing about their skill levels. It is merely a ranking scale. We also know that a student who scores 85% in the CBSE exams is a more competent student than a student who has scored 90% in the +2 government stream because, as we discussed earlier, higher level cognitive skills are learned, and because assessment, especially formative assessment, is rigorous and challenging in the CBSE stream. Let's take any top class institution in India or abroad. We will find that continuous internal assessment marks have an equal or higher weightage than end semester marks. While our weightage is 80% for end semester and 20% for continuous assessment, the IITs or IIMs have 50 to 50 or even 40 to 60 for end semester versus continuous assessment. The focus of their assessments is to ensure the same mastery level in all the students of a program and not simply to create a ranking scale. That is one reason why they make a valid claim for providing quality education. Summative assessments too should test for the attainment of learning outcomes and must be evaluated rigorously, with students being given detailed explanations about why they scored only the marks they scored. They are as important and necessary as formative assessment tests. But by doing only summative assessment, and that too perhaps not in the way it should be done, we do a gross injustice to students because the quality of learning is tied inextricably to the quality of testing. We might understand this more with the following figure. If we take the marks in an end semester exam, they will fall into a pattern known as the bell curve or the normal distribution curve, with the highest point being the average marks of the whole class, the norm. We teach for the average student and we create the question paper for the end semester exam with the average student in mind. Because of this, we have a pattern whereby, for example, roughly 25% of the students will get below 25%, 50% of the students will get marks between 25% and 70% approximately, and 25% of the students will get more than 70%. We create the question paper with different difficulty levels solely to get such a gradation of ranking. The injustice in this is that we are perpetuating a system whereby 25% of the students are always doomed to be seen as poorly performing students and the majority of students are only average. Understanding how to set and evaluate effective formative and summative assessment tests or criterion reference tests and norm reference tests is extremely crucial in ensuring that effective learning is taking place, thus making us effective teachers. We were discussing very briefly the basic background theory necessary to understand the concept of the learning outcome. We also had only touched upon the learning outcomes in a single classroom session. But there is a cascading effect for learning outcomes, which is reflected in the next slide. We discussed learning outcomes at the level of the single classroom session, which is at the bottom of this pyramid. But these learning outcomes are dependent on the learning outcomes of a unit or module of which it is a part, which is the next higher level. For example, we might need 3 classroom sessions to teach a poem by Donne in the general English class. And the learning outcomes of each of the 3 sessions could be different, and each of them will be dependent on the learning outcomes of the other 2 and of this unit as a whole. Similarly, learning outcomes of a unit or module depend on the learning outcomes of the course. And course learning outcomes depend on the program learning outcomes, and the program learning outcomes depend on the program learning objectives. As we discussed earlier, it is easier to move from learning objectives to learning outcomes at each level. But among these, writing the program objective would be very helpful, and that is why only program learning objectives have been mentioned here. One could spell out the learning objectives at the other levels too. In this figure, dependency is upwards from the lowest level to its immediately higher level, as is marked by the arrow on the left. But when we plan the curriculum and the syllabus, we have to start from the top at the program level and then write out learning objectives and outcomes to the other lower levels, as the arrow on the right shows. If we don't have clarity on the program outcomes, it would be difficult to write the course outcomes, and this could in turn affect the clarity and focus of the class learning outcomes. But there is one more level above program objectives. We might have heard about it a lot, especially those who are associated with the IQAC, but we generally don't give much importance to this aspect when we plan learning outcomes. And this is the vision and mission statement of the institution. Let us now take a look at a sample vision and mission statement taken from the website of an institution. The highlighted text here ought to be interpreted as a guideline for the kind of programs the institution should be running and the kind of syllabus and teaching methodologies it should be adopting. For example, the phrase internationally recognized institution implies that the benchmarks for the institution should be the curriculum, teaching, learning, and research modalities of the top institutions in the world. Similarly, promotion of human dignity and cultural heritage implies that there ought to be programs or courses on human values, courses with cultural exchange programs, or tie-ups with NGOs as part of the curriculum. The same applies to the mission statement. The first mission statement here to produce quote, intellectually trained, morally upright, socially committed, spiritually inspired, and ecologically conscious students, unquote, is actually advocating outcome-based education with focus on all three domains of learning within the curriculum. And the last mission statement could be read as the instigation to start, for example, a course or a program in social or religious history of Kerala. The vision and mission statement could actually decide the kind of innovative, self-created programs the institution could run, especially if it is an autonomous college. And it offers powerful instigation to chart new programs and courses. It is important for all the stakeholders of an institution to buy into and be inspired by the vision and mission of the institution. Everybody, especially the teachers and the students, must feel that they are part of something significant and have a role to play in it. It might also help if departments too have vision and mission statements and the freedom to attain the aims of such a statement in order to play a role in the fulfillment of the vision and mission. A sample vision and mission statement taken from a department website is given for an undergraduate program. Such a vision and mission could evolve into a departmental objective. For example, at least 20% of the students will, after this UG program, go on to do their higher studies in top universities or institutions outside Kerala. So, framing good vision and mission statements are also critical in framing good learning outcomes. Let's now move on to the next part of this presentation and look at some sample learning objectives and outcomes, starting with program learning objectives and outcomes, to course learning objectives and outcomes, and then on to module learning objectives and outcomes in order to get a little bit more clarity into the process of writing learning outcomes. The first one is a program objective, a generic one for any undergraduate program. Note that it is a list of program objectives and not outcomes. That is the purpose of the highlight in the title. So it is written from the perspective of the teacher and the institution. This is a randomly created list of objectives. Please read it and see whether these could be the objectives for the students of your undergraduate batch. Now let us get a bit more specific and see what program outcomes for a BA program in English language and literature could look like. By the end of the course, students will demonstrate an understanding of the social, political, historical, cultural context which produce the literary text and how these shape the text. They will be able to evaluate critically the contributions of the major writers, to critically analyze and compare literary texts, to demonstrate an awareness of the major literary critical trends, to create literary texts of their own using prominent literary texts as their models, to demonstrate significant English language skills through the work assigned to them, and to demonstrate an understanding of the research process. This too is a randomly created list. But do notice the shift in perspective from that of the teacher to the student. These outcomes now have become specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound, haven't they? So how many learning outcomes does one need to write? The general consensus seems to be for around 4 to 6. From a program outcome, let us quickly move on to a course learning outcome for a course in a BA English program in a foreign college, the Columbus State Community College. These are the course outcomes for a course on Survey of Canonical British Literary Works written from 900 to 1789. Let's just get down to some courses which really concern us. What will course objectives and course outcomes look like for the general English course we teach at the undergraduate level? The focus here is on general English papers or courses because a majority of us spend a majority of our time teaching general English classes, don't we? We teach around 23 credits worth of general English classes across 5 courses in 4 semesters for any one UG program. Now, would you agree with the statement that we should be focusing on teaching English language skills in these general English classes? Assuming that we agree, the objectives for a general English course, seen individually or cumulatively, could be something like the following. The objectives are to help students improve their English language skills, to introduce them to the content, ideas, language, and literariness of literary texts, to help them do well in the English paper of competitive examinations, and to help them read and understand books in their disciplines. The one on competitive examinations was a kind of reverse engineering, because we have a course on English for career in the second year. These are objectives written from the teacher's perspective. So, what could course learning outcomes look like in a general English course? By the end of the course, the students will demonstrate an intermediate level ability in listening and reading and a basic level ability in speaking and writing, identify basic literary devices in literary texts, score more than 70% in tests modeled on real competitive examination question papers, etc. This would be a basic list, but we would need to drill these further down like the statements in brackets when we prepare learning outcomes for the different courses we have in the 4 semesters. The purpose here was just to give a very basic idea about how course objectives and outcomes could be written and the difference in their perspectives. Let's go back once again to the process of writing learning outcomes. One should ideally start from the highest level, which is the vision and mission statement. Once this is written with clarity, the institution will decide on the programs which it can run. Then we would write the program objectives followed by the program outcomes. Once the program outcomes are written out, it will give us the clarity to frame the curriculum. That is, which are the courses we need in each program, what kind of weightage or credits, that is teaching hours per week, we need to give for each course, the summative assessment pattern for each course, etc. After formulating the curriculum, we would spell out the course objectives and the course learning outcomes for each of the courses in the program. What comes after formulating the course outcomes? Preparing the course materials and syllabus for each course. After we have done this, we would attempt to formulate appropriate summative assessment tools. The model question paper given in the syllabus is a sample summative assessment tool. The to and fro arrows indicate that the process need not always be unidirectional. There could be a going back and forth between the process. Now, if we are an affiliated college under the university, who defines and maps out the different steps in the process up to this point? It is the university or the board of studies, isn't it? So we as teachers do not have much of a role in this process. An autonomous college, on the other hand, has the freedom to create all the elements in the process outlined till this point. That is the academic freedom touted for autonomy, and it is a huge responsibility and an exciting challenge to modify these elements according to the needs of students. If we are not an autonomous college, but we have decided to go for outcome-based education, we will realize at this point that we are suddenly at an impasse, a serious mismatch. We discover to our consternation that the learning outcomes and formative assessment tests we have created for each of the modules or units within a course are at odds with the course outcomes prepared by the university. We also realize that the course materials and syllabus designed by the university are almost completely ineffective in helping students attain the learning outcomes we have set for them. For example, if we decide that the learning outcomes for the general English paper should focus on the student learning the language skills, the course material and the summative assessment tools prepared by the university are not adequate for this at all. This is where we have to innovate. But before we do this, we have to take into account certain challenges created by the present system and overcome them in order to make the outcome-based education effective. What are these? The first challenge is that we have to maintain a balancing act between helping students attain the learning outcomes we have formulated for our students and covering the portion and preparing the students for the end semester examination set by the university. We have to help students attain the carefully created, smart learning outcomes we have prepared and at the same time help them do well in the examination. It needs planning to do that. The next two challenges we always confront are related to the language abilities of students. We find students with very diverse levels of knowledge in the subject area, and more often than not, this is directly linked to their very diverse English language skills. Closely related to this is the lack of an environment to practice language skills. If students do not practice the 4 skills in real life or simulated real life situations, they are never going to improve their language skills. What we also know is that this lack of language skills is closely related to the social and class background of students. Finding a way forward in overcoming these related challenges through constant trial and error is the key to fulfilling our role as English language teachers. Another challenge we now face, and we'll definitely face more intensely when we take up outcome-based education, is the large size of the classroom and how to make learning effective, especially while helping students to develop their language skills in such a class. This is a problem which is confronting teachers across the world, even in the top-notch universities of the world. Consequently, there is quite a bit of material on how to manage large classes at the generic level and also at the discipline-specific level. Links to two such sites can be accessed from the PDF version of this presentation. Let's now see how we can innovate to make learning in general English classes more effective at the UG level. As a case study, let us take the first semester general English courses. Kerala University has two courses in the first semester, one on language skills and the second on writings on contemporary issues, for a total of 9 teaching hours per week, which implies a weightage of 9 credits. We first have to take the considered view that the essential goal of teaching any of the general English courses is to improve the English language skills of the students. Now, are there any skills we need to focus on in college? Of course, language skills are to be learned simultaneously, but should we give more importance to any of the skills? At the higher education level, when we are trying to impart the knowledge and the skills for students to go for a higher degree or to take up a job, the focus should be on teaching reading and writing skills, shouldn't it? There's another important point we need to keep in mind. Would we agree with the proposition that the level of English language skills plays a key role in upward social mobility or even poverty alleviation? If that is the case, we have a serious responsibility to focus on improving the English language skills of all the students on campus as part of our commitment to their future. Let's next decide to plan for teaching as a team. There could be usually around 3 to 5 teachers taking these two courses for any one batch, and sometimes more than this to teach the students of all the UG programs in college. Wouldn't it help immensely if the teachers sat down together and discussed how they plan to teach the language skills using the material given to them or by creating new material? This would definitely go a long way in ensuring that the quality of teaching learning is more consistent across all teachers and batches. Accountability is something we have to take upon ourselves. How can we take on a basic level of accountability? If we are assigned to teach 2 hours per week in a course, we are expected to do 36 hours in a semester. It might be quite impossible to get 36 hours, but shouldn't we make sure that we do at least 25 to 30 hours in a semester for such a class? We need these hours because once we have set learning outcomes, we will need all the hours we can manage to ensure that students attain the learning outcomes we have set for them. Once the goal of teaching these two courses is clear in our mind, the next step would be to prepare the learning outcomes and thinking tasks for each module or unit in the two papers. The course on language skills offers us a module division based on the 4 language skills, while the course on writings on contemporary issues could be divided into units, with each essay constituting a unit. We would also need to decide the proportion of time to teach each language skill and the common skills like vocabulary, grammar, spelling, pronunciation, and punctuation. The next step would be to design summative and formative tests to evaluate the attainment of the learning outcomes. We could also focus more on creating different continuous assessment tools and classroom assessment techniques as part of formative assessment. Again, as mentioned earlier, it would be immensely practical and beneficial if we do all this collectively and if we share our ideas and strategies. Just think about it. How many of us share what we do in class with our colleagues? Not only students, but the department as a whole would benefit immensely if we manage to come together to have informal and open discussions about our teaching practices with our colleagues. Even though we might become immersed in designing thinking tasks for students to help them attain specific learning outcomes, we cannot afford to ignore our responsibility towards helping our students do well in the end semester examinations. So we have to strategize how to prepare our students for these exams. Let's take an example. If we find that one of the essays given to us in the Writings on Contemporary Issues course is much beyond the reading skill level of the students, what can we do? We could, for example, summarize the essay in simple words. This could now form the reading material for them and also give them a model essay at the same time. We could even go a step further, and instead of giving the summary to all of them, we could give this to one of the brighter students or a pair of brighter students and ask them to prepare a video using appropriate images, with the summary we have written being the voiceover for the video. They will manage this brilliantly, and the students would now have material to practice their listening skill. Wouldn't the whole class be much more motivated to interact with the text if it was done this way, rather than us explaining the difficult text endlessly and with increasing frustration? And when we do give the summary essay, we should ensure they read the summary by giving them some task to do. For example, by jumbling up the paragraphs and asking them to write it out in the proper sequence, etc. We can manage to kill two birds with one stone. We have strategized to prepare them for the exam and created an environment to practice their language skills. There is one important thing we cannot afford to ignore when we focus on teaching language skills. How do we know that the language skills of our students have improved by the end of the course or the program? This is where a pre-test to evaluate the language skills of students before they start the program, that is at the start of the first semester itself, is crucial. We would therefore need to design, for example, a 1-hour pre-test which objectively evaluates their language skills as well as their spelling, vocabulary, grammar, punctuation and pronunciation. And this test must be at the level of a final exit test, evaluating their expected language skills by the end of the course or the program, so that the two results are comparable. Finally, it is up to each teacher to plan the learning outcomes and the thinking tasks for each classroom session they have with their students, and to create the formative assessment tests to check if they have attained the learning outcomes. In the next part of the session, let us see how learning outcomes change when we move from a general English class to a BA English main class to an MA class. Let's assume that we have been given the same done poem, a valediction forbidding mourning, to teach at all three levels. What will the learning outcomes look like at the three levels? The learning outcomes when we teach this poem to a general English class in the 4th semester course Readings and Literature would look something like this. By the end of the unit, the students should demonstrate an understanding of the poem, should be able to identify the metaphors in the poem, demonstrate the meanings of 5 words in the poem, pronounce 5 words correctly, complete a guided composition as an answer to a given question, and then write with help on a theme related to the poem. We might get 3 sessions to complete this poem with these outcomes. That is what is written in the title. It would also be good to keep in mind that we can move from one skill to another in the process of teaching learning. For example, students could read an email about a trip, then write a response to the email, then listen to a phone message about a change in plan, and speak to someone about a planned trip. Let's take a quick look at some thinking tasks which can be created for this poem in order for the outcomes to be attained. The first thinking task could be a pre-reading vocabulary test to help them understand a few previously unknown words. This could be individual work to be done before class. We are here assuming that a student in the 4th semester would have the previous knowledge necessary to answer these questions in the tasks created. The words in this exercise are those used in the poem. Another thinking task could be a comprehension exercise to be given to them after they have read the poem with comprehension. The task given is a summary of the first 3 stanzas with the sentences in jumbled order. This task could be pair work in class. We could give the students another vocabulary exercise, this time after reading the poem, to help them cement their knowledge. This could be individual or pair work. The next thinking task could be a guided composition. Fill in the blanks with grammatical words. The theme of this letter is similar to the theme of the poem, a farewell, and gives students a model for an informal letter too. This should be easy enough to be done individually or at home. The last one is again a guided composition, a cloze test, CLOZD, where the students have to fill in with appropriate words. This paragraph is actually an answer to one of the paragraph questions in the textbook, and this could be informed to the students so that they get a clue about the content. Here we are focusing on reading and writing or vocabulary skills, but we have also strategized to help them prepare for the end semester exams. All these thinking tasks have been randomly prepared for us to understand the possibilities of what could be designed if we have a slight focus on what should be done in a general English class. Let us now take a look at possible learning outcomes for a BA English main class if the same poem were to be taught. Again, we would have decided that we would get only the same 3 classroom sessions to teach this poem. The learning outcomes would look something like this. By the end of the unit, that is after 3 sessions, students should be able to recall the key events in the life of the poet, list the major texts of the poet and the major themes, identify and state the key features of the socio-historical context of the poem, demonstrate an awareness of the explicit and implicit meanings of the text, analyze metaphysical conceit in terms of Dr. Johnson's definition of the same, analyze the metaphors in the poem in terms of tenor and vehicle, list the formal features of the poem, compare and evaluate the themes of a few poems by Donne, etc. Shall we presume to be in agreement about this possible list of objectives? Now, the first thing we might realize when we read this list is that it would not be possible to expect students to attain all these outcomes within the 3 classroom sessions we have earmarked for ourselves. This is where the concept of the flipped classroom comes in. I'm sure most of us would be familiar with this notion. It simply means that we have to allocate the learning activities or thinking tasks in such a manner that around 40% of the thinking tasks are to be done outside the classroom by the students, individually or in pairs, before or after classroom sessions, while 60% of the learning outcomes could be targeted inside the classroom. A thing to note would be that students would be getting new knowledge through this kind of outside classroom activity, unlike the homework at the school level. For example, the first 3 learning outcomes could be attained outside the classroom if we assign them a particular reading or listening task, at the end of which they are given questions or work which would fulfill the outcomes. Learning outcomes 4 and 5 could be handled inside the classroom, while number 6 could be done outside the class, assuming they already have previous knowledge about tenor and vehicle. Similarly for the rest of the outcomes. But students would need to be told specifically what is expected of them when they learn outside the classroom and how they ought to come prepared to do in-classroom work. Only with this kind of careful planning for each of the 3 sessions can we hope to complete the unit as defined in the learning outcomes within the stipulated period of 3 sessions. So, what would learning outcomes look like for MA students learning the same poem within the same slot of 3 hours? It could look something like this. By the end of the unit, students would be able to demonstrate an understanding of the explicit and implicit meanings of the text, analyze the poem in terms of the concepts in Eliot's essay, The Metaphysical Poets, interpret the poem from the perspective of some concept or framework in literary theory, compare the theme, style and output of the poet with his contemporaries, write a poem on the theme farewell using at least one metaphysical conceit, etc. The last outcome is an implicit argument that creative writing must be part of the English literature curriculum. Here one might notice a couple of things when these outcomes are compared with those of the UG level. First of all, the 3 classroom sessions we get would be still more inadequate to help the students attain the learning outcomes outlined. Consequently, we might have to allocate more outside the classroom work for PG students, with 60% thinking tasks to be done outside the classroom and only 40% done within. These percentages are not fixed. They are just an indication to show how work could be allocated inside and outside the classroom and how the time for learning outside the classroom increases as one moves up the levels. Secondly, one could observe a sort of distribution of labor. The UG learning outcomes are focused more on the content and style of the poem, that is on the formal level, with some foray into the socio-historical context of the writer and the poem. The PG learning outcomes assume this learning. It takes these outcomes as the previous knowledge of the students and builds on from there. It would be useful to come to these kinds of distribution of focus at the departmental level. Similarly, the outcomes assume certain previous knowledge. If this poem is going to be taught in the second semester, we assume that they would have gained previous knowledge about literary theory in the first semester. What this discussion would have also demonstrated is that if learning outcomes are written appropriately for the different levels, the teaching learning process will naturally get more intense, compelling, and challenging as one progresses from one level to the next. In this context, in passing, it would be immensely useful to read Elaine Showalter's book, Teaching Literature, to understand how literature is taught and learned in foreign universities. So let's conclude by going back to the start of the session. This is where we started off from, when we tried to understand what happens in an ideal classroom, or when it would be possible for us to say that effective learning has happened in an individual classroom session. Let's try to rephrase this understanding in the light of what we have been discussing about learning outcomes. So, what ought to happen in every single classroom session? The first step would be to create learning outcomes for the individual class. This would be followed by selecting or creating the teaching learning material on which the learning outcomes are based. Next comes planning the thinking tasks to be given in class to help the students attain the learning outcomes. These steps happen before the individual classroom session, and all three steps here would obviously be conditioned by the learning outcomes and thinking tasks planned for the unit or module of which this classroom session is a part. As an example, let's assume that we are taking the ELT course for the PG program and we have to cover the various methods of English language teaching. If we have been able to allocate only 2 hours for this, what could be our plan? We could, for example, decide that the mode of learning would be experiential. We could plan to divide the class into 4 groups. We could send one group to the Alliance Francaise and ask them to observe and report on the language teaching practice there, which is essentially the direct method. For the communicative approach, we could ask another group to watch a few episodes of Mind Your Language. For the grammar translation method, the group could be asked to have a discussion with a language teacher and select students and get their reaction to teaching learning a language with the help of translation exercises. And the last batch could go to a school and see how any language is being taught and learned in a particular class. All groups could present case study reports about the methods adopted. But before we send them out, they would need to have previous knowledge about approaches, methodology, and methods in ELT and the essential features of the different methods. If this is the overall plan for this module, we can decide what will happen in the 2 classroom sessions and plan the activity for each of those 2 sessions accordingly, with a large part of the learning being done outside the classroom. This much of planning happens before the classroom session. What is the process for effective learning within the classroom? We have essentially 4 steps inside the classroom. The first is to ensure that they have adequate previous knowledge for the session with oral or written quizzes. We then spell out the learning outcomes and tell the students clearly what they are expected to do within this session and the next, and what is going to happen in between. We would have to give them very precise instructions for the activities they undertake outside the classroom. We ensure that the students know what is to be done inside the class and make them do the thinking tasks. And finally, we have to check them constantly to see if they are doing what they are expected to do and provide constant feedback on their activities. After one session or after both the sessions, we would need to assess them formatively to check if they have attained the learning outcomes set for them at the beginning of the unit. This will happen after the classroom session. And finally, we would need to see whether the learning outcomes and the thinking tasks we had set fulfilled what was expected of them. If not, we would need to review and reframe both to ensure that learning happens effectively in the manner we expected it to happen. That brings us almost to the close of the session. However, since this is a session on outcome-based education, it would be remiss of me if I did not do at least minimal formative assessment to check whether the objectives and outcomes set out at the beginning of the session have been attained. What follows is a sample formative test which anybody could work through to see how well they were able to follow the session. But we should be able to answer these questions without going back to the lecture. The review has three sections. Section A harks back to the ice-breaking session at the beginning. What would your answer be now that we have come to the end of the session to the following question? What do you think could be the reason for the general belief that teaching in college is easier than teaching in school? Section B has 10 objective type questions. The first one is, outcome-based education addresses the following key questions. A. How do you close the gap between what students have achieved and what they were expected to achieve? B. What do you want the students to know, be able to do, or value? C. How will you know that they have achieved it? D. How can you best help students to achieve it? Put the above questions in the proper logical and chronological sequence. The next one. Which level of cognitive skill is applied to answer the above question? And the next. In outcome-based education, the teacher is more a facilitator than a performer. True or false? Which level of cognitive skill is tested in the above question? The next one. The personality of the teacher can affect the effectiveness of learning. However, a discussion of this was considered out of the scope of this session. True or false? And again, which level of cognitive skill is tested here? In the next question, two statements are given. One is a program learning objective and the other is a program learning outcome. The statements are to give students the necessary skills to take up teaching as a career, and the second one, to demonstrate critical, analytical and creative thinking skills by producing a 50-page dissertation. Four statements are given. Which of these statements is true? The ninth question. This session has helped me understand some of the gaps in my awareness of expected teacher competencies and offers me a sense of direction regarding how to close those gaps. Would you agree or disagree with this statement? And the last question in this section. This is an assessment in which domain of learning? Section C of this questionnaire is essentially a feedback telling me if this session has fulfilled the only function of any webinar, that is, whether the session will in some way impact or modify the listener's classroom teaching practice. If you would like to answer these questions and get an immediate response to your answers, please find the link to the questionnaire in the PDF version of the file on the website given in the last slide and submit your answers. There is one more thing I will need to do, again because this is a session on outcome-based education. I will have to review the answers to the questionnaire and go back to the objectives and outcomes of the session and see if they have been met. If they haven't, I'll have to rephrase my outcomes and or review the thinking tasks and teaching learning strategies adopted for this session. So what is the way forward? As teachers, we always have to be self-aware and self-critical. It is always useful to do a critical SWOT analysis. As part of our professionalism and self-accountability, we should assess our strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and challenges as an educator, see how we can leverage our strengths, mitigate our weaknesses, and turn the challenges we face into opportunities to make us stronger as teachers. Continuous professional development is something we would always have to commit to. For starters, we would need to get educated in pedagogical principles and practices, and perhaps the best and most accessible course relating to higher education would be Indira Gandhi National Open University's postgraduate diploma in higher education. As an added incentive, this program is equivalent to a 4-week course of the UGC HRDC's orientation or refresher course. It would be very useful as English language teachers to do a certificate or diploma in ELT. A basic course would be IGNO's Certificate in English Language Teaching, which is a six-month program again equivalent to an orientation course. But a much more comprehensive and expensive course would be Cambridge University's Certificate in English Language Teaching for Adults, which will qualify us to teach the English language anywhere in the world, as will a PG certificate or diploma in teaching of English from FLU, which will also give us a thorough grounding in modern English grammar. There are wonderful websites in all universities dedicated for teachers who want to improve their teaching skills. One of the best is the Center for Teaching at Vanderbilt University. There are also MOOCs on Coursera for teachers on language teaching and on English for teaching. And finally, what are the key takeaways of the session? Have clearly formulated learning outcomes, inform students what they are and how you plan to help them achieve it and what your expectations are. Give students thinking tasks to do and give them feedback. Make them read and write a lot and give them models of good writing. Set high expectations, teach them how to learn, use Bloom's taxonomy, exploit the resources of the internet, create supplementary material, keep on learning, stay humble, enjoy yourself. Learning is creation, not consumption. Knowledge is not something a learner absorbs, but what a learner creates. Hope that has happened in this session. And education is not something you finish. This session is definitely not the final word on outcome-based education. It was just a very basic introduction. And there could have been points which might have been debatable. So don't believe everything that was said here. In spite of these limitations, learning about learning outcomes could hopefully lead to some outcomes. Thank you.